Tonight we descend into dangerous territory, the shadowed corners of exceptional minds, where intelligence becomes both sanctuary and prison. If you've ever felt like your thoughts are simultaneously your greatest asset and your most relentless tormentor, you've found your people. Welcome to the place where overthinking meets existential exhaustion, and where Carl Jung's insights illuminate the peculiar suffering of those cursed with seeing too much understanding too deeply and feeling everything while pretending to feel nothing. This is for those of you lying awake at 3 a.m., not because you can't sleep, but because your mind refuses to stop analyzing why you can't sleep. A delightfully recursive problem that would make Freud chuckle from beyond the grave. Tonight we explore why exceptional intelligence often comes with a price tag written in emotional currency, and why the brightest minds sometimes cast the darkest shadows. Forget the cheerful myth that intelligence equals happiness. You're brilliant. Mind isn't a superpower. It's more like having X-ray vision in a world where everyone insists the emperor's clothes are beautiful. You see the bones beneath the skin, the mechanics behind the magic, and somehow this clarity has become your burden rather than your blessing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, particularly those of you joining us from various stages of existential crisis across different time zones. Dim the lights, adjust the volume, and prepare your mind for a different kind of examination. Tonight you're not just in your bedroom, you're entering the laboratory of consciousness where Jung once mapped the terrain of the psyche. Here intelligence isn't celebrated or condemned, it's simply understood as the complex force it truly is. The good news? Your overthinking has purpose. The concerning news that purpose might not be what you think it is, and understanding it requires facing some uncomfortable truths about why brilliant minds often struggle with the simplest human experiences, like rest connection and the radical act of simply being present. This video is for those who've discovered that having an exceptional mind doesn't automatically grant you an exceptional life. Instead, you might find yourself caught in the peculiar prison of seeing solutions everywhere, except to your own deeper hungers. For peace, for belonging, for the simple grace of not having to think so intensely about everything, including the very act of thinking itself. Jung understood something profound about the relationship between intelligence and suffering. He recognized that the same mental faculties that allow us to navigate complex philosophical territories can trap us in labyrinths of our own making. Tonight we'll explore why this happens, what it costs us, and perhaps most importantly, how we might transform this burden into something resembling wisdom. Carl Jung once observed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But what happens when your brilliant mind becomes the very obstacle preventing this becoming? What occurs when the tool meant for understanding, life begins consuming the life it was meant to understand? For those blessed and cursed with exceptional intelligence, the mind often transforms from servant to master, from ally to warden. You know this intimately. The way your thoughts cascade like an avalanche, each idea triggering 10 more until you're buried beneath the weight of your own mental productivity. Your brain, designed for survival and problem-solving, has become a factory that never closes, producing insights, analyses, and connections at a rate that would exhaust any normal operating system. This isn't mere overthinking. This is hyperactive cognitive processing, a survival mechanism that somewhere along the line convinced itself that if it just thinks hard enough, fast enough, deeply enough, it can solve the fundamental problems of existence. Your mind has become a detective investigating a crime that was never committed, gathering evidence for a case that will never go to trial. The exhaustion you feel isn't physical fatigue. It's the bone-deep weariness that comes from carrying the weight of perpetual analysis. Every conversation becomes data to process. Every experience gets filtered through multiple interpretive frameworks. Every moment of potential peace gets interrupted by the mind's insistent need to understand, categorize, and optimize. Jung understood this phenomenon as part of what he called the thinking function, becoming overdeveloped at the expense of other psychological functions. When thinking dominates feeling, sensation, and intuition become suppressed, creating an internal imbalance that manifests as existential exhaustion. You become like a violinist who has perfected technique but forgotten how to feel the music. The cruel irony is that this mental hyperactivity often emerges from early emotional wounds. The child who learned that being smart meant being safe, that intelligence could provide protection, that emotional authenticity couldn't offer. So the mind expanded to fill the space where spontaneous feeling should have lived, creating a brilliant but incomplete human being. Consider the metaphor of a castle made of glass. Beautiful, impressive, architecturally stunning, but ultimately cold, isolated, and fragile. This is often what happens to the exceptional mind. It creates elaborate structures of thought that inspire admiration but provide little warmth. Others look upon your mental palace with awe, never suspecting that you spend most of your time alone inside, surrounded by crystal walls that let you see everything but touch nothing. The first step toward freedom isn't trying to think less. That's like trying to stop a river by building a dam. Instead, it's understanding why the river flows so urgently. What is your mind trying to protect you from? What wound is it attempting to solve through sheer cognitive force? What early experience taught you that thinking was safer than feeling, that analysis was more reliable than trust? Jung called this process active imagination. The practice of dialoguing with the unconscious aspects of the psyche, rather than trying to control them through rational analysis. When you feel the familiar cascade of overthinking beginning, instead of fighting it or feeding it, try addressing it directly. What are you trying to tell me? What are you trying to protect me from? What do you need to feel safe enough to rest? The three-stage technique for returning from mind to body begins with acknowledgement. I notice I'm thinking excessively. This isn't judgment, it's simply observation. The second stage is inquiry. What am I trying to solve or avoid right now? The third stage is embodiment. What does my body need in this moment? This might be breath movement, touch, or simply the radical act of feeling your feet on the ground. Your exceptional mind isn't a mistake or a burden to be cured. It's a powerful instrument that has been playing the same song for so long it has forgotten it knows other melodies. The goal isn't to diminish your intelligence, but to expand the orchestra of your being, allowing thinking to collaborate with feeling, sensation, and intuition, rather than drowning them out. There's a particular suffering that belongs to those who carry exceptional intelligence, the compulsive need to be useful, to shine light on every darkness except their own. Jung spoke of individuation as the central task of human development. But for brilliant minds, this process often gets derailed by what we might call the lamp syndrome, the unconscious belief that your worth depends on how brightly you can illuminate the paths of others. You know this pattern intimately. Someone shares a problem, and immediately your mind begins generating solutions with the efficiency of a supercomputer. You become the person others turn to for insight, for clarity, for the kind of penetrating analysis that cuts through confusion like a blade through silk. And somewhere in this process of perpetual illumination, you lose track of your own inner landscape, your own needs, your own darkness that deserves gentle attention rather than harsh spotlights. This isn't generosity. It's a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. The brilliant mind often learns early that love and acceptance come through performance, through being impressive rather than being authentic. So you develop what Jung might recognize as a complex, an autonomous pattern of thoughts and feelings that operates independently of conscious control, compelling you to be endlessly useful while never asking what you yourself might need. The tragedy is that this pattern often originates from deep emotional hunger. The child who learned that being smart earned positive attention, that insights were rewarded with approval, that intelligence could bridge the gap where emotional connection felt uncertain. So the mind expands to fill the space where unconditional love should have been, creating a person who knows how to solve everyone else's problems, but has forgotten how to identify their own. Consider the lighthouse metaphor. Standing tall, sending its beam across dangerous waters, guiding ships safely to shore, while remaining fixed, isolated, never itself journeying anywhere. The lighthouse serves a crucial function, but it experiences life only through the ships it saves, never through adventures of its own. This is often the lived experience of exceptional intelligence. You become a landmark in other people's stories while remaining static in your own. The cost of this pattern extends far beyond simple exhaustion. When you consistently prioritize other people's psychological needs over your own, you begin to lose touch with your authentic self. Your own emotions become foreign territories. Your own desires feel selfish or irrelevant. Your own pain gets intellectualized rather than felt, analyzed rather than healed. Jung understood this as a form of inflation. Not the ego inflation we typically think of, but its shadow opposite, the inflation of service, where the ego identifies so completely with being helpful that it forgets its own humanity. You become addicted to being needed while losing the capacity to recognize your own needs. You become fluent in the language of everyone else's psychology while becoming illiterate in your own. The breakthrough comes when you realize that your intelligence doesn't need to justify its existence through constant utility. Your mind isn't a vending machine that must dispense insights to earn its place in the world. Your worth isn't contingent on your ability to solve, fix, or illuminate. These are gifts you can offer when you choose to, not debts you must pay to deserve love and acceptance. The practice of reclaiming your inner territory begins with what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. When someone presents you with a problem, practice holding both the impulse to help and the awareness of your own needs. Ask yourself, am I offering this insight from genuine generosity or from compulsive need to be useful? What would it feel like to simply listen without needing to fix? This isn't about becoming selfish or withholding your gifts. It's about learning to offer them from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion. It's about remembering that your intelligence is one facet of a complete human being who deserves care, attention, and gentle curiosity about their own inner world. Start with small acts of self-attention. Before launching into analysis of someone else's situation, take a moment to check in with yourself. How am I feeling right now? What do I need? What would serve my own growth in this moment? This isn't narcissism. It's basic psychological hygiene for minds that have learned to see everyone except themselves. There exists a particular form of suffering that Jung rarely addressed directly but understood implicitly: the gradual freezing of the emotional body that occurs when intelligence becomes a fortress against feeling. For those blessed with exceptional analytical abilities, reason can transform from a tool of liberation into an elegant prison, creating individuals who can dissect the mechanics of emotion while remaining strangers to their own hearts. You recognize this pattern. Someone hurts you, and instead of feeling the pain, you immediately begin analyzing why they acted as they did, what psychological patterns might explain their behavior, how your own past might have contributed to the dynamic. The feeling gets buried beneath layers of understanding, like archaeological artifacts covered by sediment, preserved but inaccessible, protected but lifeless. This isn't emotional maturity, it's emotional bypassing disguised as sophistication. The brilliant mind, faced with the raw chaos of feeling, does what it does best. It creates order through analysis. But emotions aren't problems to be solved, they're experiences to be felt, messages to be received, energies to be metabolized by the body rather than processed by the brain. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we've rejected or denied. For highly intelligent individuals, the shadow often contains not darkness in the conventional sense, but rather the full spectrum of human feeling that has been deemed too messy, too irrational, too potentially disruptive to the carefully constructed order of the thinking mind. The cost of this emotional sterility extends far beyond personal relationships, though those certainly suffer when you can analyze love, but not feel it, understand hurt, but not heal it. The deeper cost is neurological. Recent neuroscience research suggests that emotional suppression actually impairs cognitive flexibility over time. The very intelligence you're trying to protect by avoiding feeling becomes less adaptive, more rigid, more disconnected from the full spectrum of human experience. That feeds creative thinking. Consider the metaphor of a perfectly tuned violin with severed strings. The instrument is flawless in its construction, maintained with meticulous care, capable of producing the most exquisite music, but silent, unable to fulfill its essential purpose because the very elements that would allow it to sing have been cut away in the name of preservation. This pattern often develops as a sophisticated survival strategy. Perhaps you learned early that emotional expression was unsafe, that vulnerability was punished, that the mind was more reliable than the heart. So intelligence expanded to fill the space where emotional authenticity should have lived, creating a person who can navigate complex intellectual territories while remaining lost in the simple geography of their own feeling world. The particularly cruel aspect of this adaptation is that it often works, at least initially. You may excel academically, professionally, socially, as long as success is measured by cognitive performance rather than emotional integration. But eventually the body keeps the score. The unexpressed emotions don't disappear, they crystallize into physical tension, chronic anxiety, a persistent sense that something essential is missing from your experience of being alive. Jung understood this as a failure of what he called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity that bridges conscious and unconscious thinking and feeling, order and chaos. When this function is underdeveloped, you become split, against yourself, capable of extraordinary insight about life while remaining alienated from your own living experience. The path back to emotional embodiment isn't about abandoning intelligence or deliberately cultivating irrationality. It's about learning to use your analytical abilities in service of integration rather than avoidance. This begins with developing what we might call emotional curiosity, approaching your feelings with the same careful attention you would give to an interesting philosophical problem. When you notice yourself moving into analytical mode, to avoid feeling something, try this practice. Stop and ask, what am I trying not to feel right now? Then, instead of analyzing the emotion, simply describe its physical sensations. There's a tightness in my chest, a heaviness in my stomach, a buzzing in my hands. This isn't therapy, it's basic embodiment, learning to inhabit your full humanity rather than just the top floor. The goal isn't to become less intelligent, but to become more complete, to allow your exceptional mind to collaborate with your feeling nature rather than suppress it, to discover that emotions, far from being obstacles to clear thinking, are actually sources of information that can inform and enrich your analytical abilities. Your intelligence is extraordinary, but it was never meant to be the entirety of your existence. It's one voice in the choir of your being, powerful and important, but most beautiful when harmonizing with the full range of human experience rather than singing solo in an empty cathedral. Here lies one of the most frustrating paradoxes for brilliant minds seeking to create change in their lives. The very speed and agility of thought that serves you so well in intellectual pursuits can become a significant obstacle to manifestation. Jung never wrote explicitly about manifestation in the New Age sense, but his understanding of the psyche's relationship to time and synchronicity reveals why rapid-fire thinking often interferes with the slower, more organic rhythms of life unfolding. You know this frustration intimately. Your mind can conceive possibilities, solve problems, and generate strategies with lightning speed. You can see the path from here to there with crystalline clarity, mapping out the logical steps, anticipating obstacles, optimizing approaches. Yet somehow, despite all this mental preparation, the external world seems to move at a glacial pace, if it moves at all in the directions you've so carefully calculated. This isn't a failure of intelligence or planning, it's a misunderstanding of how consciousness interacts with reality. Your thinking mind operates in linear time, cause and effect sequence and logic, problem and solution. But manifestation, like all creative processes, operates in what Jung called kairos, not chronological time, but the qualitative time of readiness, ripeness, and synchronistic convergence. The faster your mind moves, the more likely it is to generate what we might call anxious manifestation, attempts to force reality, to match your mental timelines, rather than allowing your desires to unfold according to their own organic rhythm. This creates a vibrational mismatch between your hurried mental energy and the more patient cyclical energy of manifestation itself. Consider the metaphor of a gardener. with perfect knowledge of botany trying to make plants grow faster by pulling on their stems. The understanding is flawless, the intention pure, but the approach violates the fundamental nature of how growth occurs. Seeds have their own timing, their own seasons, their own relationship with soil and water and light that can't be accelerated through mental force, no matter how sophisticated that force might be. For highly intelligent individuals, this presents a particular challenge because you're accustomed to your mental abilities producing results. You think, therefore things happen. You analyze, therefore problems get solved. You plan, therefore outcomes improve. But manifestation requires a different faculty. What Jung might recognize as a form of active receptivity, an ability to hold intention without attachment to timeline, to maintain focus without forcing outcomes. The neurological reality is that chronic mental acceleration actually interferes with the brain states most conducive to manifestation. When your mind is running at high speed, you're typically in beta or even gamma brainwave states, excellent for analysis and problem solving, but not optimal for the theta and alpha states associated with creativity, intuition, and what researchers now call the manifestation frequency. This doesn't mean your intelligence is a liability in manifestation. It means it needs to be employed differently. Instead of using your mental faculties to force outcomes, you can use them to create coherence between your conscious desires and your emotional state. Instead of thinking your way to manifestation, you can think your way into the feelings and beliefs that allow manifestation to occur naturally. The practice begins with what Jung called patience with the unconscious. When you feel the familiar urge to push, plan, and accelerate, pause and ask, what if the timing of this unfolding is perfect, even if it doesn't match my mental timeline? What if my job isn't to make this happen, but to become the person who naturally attracts what I'm seeking? This requires developing what we might call strategic patience, using your intelligence not to control outcomes, but to understand and align with natural patterns of growth and change. Study the seasons of your own life. Notice how your biggest breakthroughs have actually unfolded. How often did they follow your carefully constructed timelines versus arriving through unexpected synchronicities and organic developments? The manifestation practice for brilliant minds involves learning to think yourself into feeling states rather than thinking yourself into outcomes. Instead of, how can I make this happen faster, ask, what would it feel like if this were already true? What would I believe about myself and life if this were my natural reality? Then use your exceptional capacity for sustained attention to cultivate those feeling states and beliefs, allowing them to change your vibrational signature, rather than forcing external circumstances to match your mental projections. Your quick mind is an asset in manifestation, but only when it learns to move at the speed of trust rather than the speed of anxiety. This means using your intelligence to create inner alignment while releasing attachment to outer timelines, to become so clear and consistent in your internal state that external reality has no choice but to eventually reorganize itself around your energetic signature. There exists a particular form of loneliness that belongs exclusively to those who see too much, understand too deeply, and feel too intensely, while maintaining the social facade of having their emotional lives perfectly organized. Jung wrote extensively about the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, but he perhaps didn't fully articulate how isolating this process becomes for minds that operate significantly outside conventional parameters. You know this loneliness. It's not the simple sadness of being alone, it's the complex ache of being surrounded by people who seem to inhabit a fundamentally different reality than the one you experience. You sit in conversations that feel like pantomimes, watch people, get excited about things that seem trivial, feel like an anthropologist studying a culture you can understand but never quite belong to. This isn't arrogance or superiority, though it's often misunderstood as such. It's the natural consequence of developing psychological complexity in a world that often rewards simplicity, of cultivating depth in environments that celebrate surface-level engagement, of seeing patterns and connections that others either can't perceive or don't want to acknowledge. The painful irony is that your very intelligence, the gift that allows you to understand human nature so clearly, becomes the barrier that prevents you from experiencing simple human connection. You can analyze why people behave as they do, predict their responses, understand their motivations with sometimes uncomfortable accuracy. But this understanding creates distance rather than intimacy, insight rather than belonging. Jung recognized this as part of what he called the night sea journey, a period of spiritual initiation where the individual must journey through isolation and darkness to discover their authentic self. For highly intelligent individuals, this journey often begins not with a dramatic spiritual crisis, but with the gradual recognition that most social environments feel like elaborate performances where everyone knows the script except you. The spiritual dimension of this isolation often goes unrecognized. You're not just different intellectually, you're often operating from a different level of consciousness, asking different questions driven by different values. While others might find meaning in external achievements, social status, or conventional markers of success, you find yourself hungry for something less tangible, truth depth, authentic connection experiences that feed the soul rather than just the ego. This can manifest as what Jung might call the outsider archetype, the perpetual observer, the one who sees clearly because they stand outside the group, but who pays for this clarity with chronic loneliness. You become like a comet crossing through familiar social solar systems, visible, perhaps admired for your uniqueness, but never orbiting long enough to establish gravitational relationships. The temptation is to adapt, to dumb down your curiosity, to pretend that small talk satisfies your need for intellectual stimulation, to act as if conventional pleasures fill the spaces in your psyche that hunger for transcendence. But this adaptation comes at a tremendous cost. The gradual suffocation of your authentic self, the slow death of the very qualities that make you uniquely valuable. Jung understood that individuation requires what he called the courage to be disliked, the willingness to be authentically yourself, even when that authenticity doesn't fit social expectations. For highly intelligent individuals, this often means accepting that your natural way of being will create distance from some people while attracting others who can appreciate depth, complexity, and authentic rather than performative connection. The transformation begins when you stop viewing your differentness as a problem to be solved and start recognizing it as an initiation to be completed. Your isolation isn't a punishment, it's a cocoon. Your loneliness isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's the natural result of outgrowing environments and relationships that no longer match your level of development. This doesn't mean becoming resigned to permanent isolation or developing a superior attitude toward those who operate differently. It means learning to value quality over quantity in relationships, depth over breadth in connections, and authenticity over acceptability in your way of being in the world. The practice involves what Jung called active solitude, using your time alone not to escape from yourself, but to develop a deeper relationship with yourself. Instead of viewing loneliness as empty space to be filled, begin to experience it as fertile ground for self-discovery. Your isolation can become a laboratory for exploring the depths of your own psyche, for developing the internal resources that make you interesting, not just to others, but to yourself. Start seeking what Jung called your people, not necessarily other highly intelligent individuals, but people who value depth, authenticity, and growth over surface-level compatibility. These connections may be rarer, but they'll feed your soul in ways that conventional social relationships never could. Your loneliness is not a life sentence, it's a spiritual degree program. The curriculum is learning to be completely comfortable with yourself, to find in your own consciousness a richness that makes solitude feel like abundance rather than deprivation. From this foundation, you can choose relationships that enhance your life rather than seeking relationships to complete it. Here we encounter one of the most perverse paradoxes of exceptional intelligence. The very mental faculties that should theoretically make life easier often become the primary obstacles to experiencing simple contentment. Jung understood this as a form of what he might call cognitive inflation, where the thinking function becomes so overdeveloped that it begins to operate autonomously, creating problems to solve, rather than allowing the psyche to rest in states of being rather than constant doing. Your brilliant mind has become addicted to complexity. Faced with a moment of potential peace, it immediately begins generating questions, problems, analyses, improvements. It's like having a brilliant employee who can't stop working. Admirable, in theory exhausting in practice, and ultimately counterproductive when what you actually need is rest rather than more productivity. This isn't a character flaw or a failure of meditation technique. This is the natural result of a mind that has learned to equate its worth with its output, its value with its insights, its identity with its intellectual performance. Somewhere along the line, your consciousness became convinced that stopping the mental machinery would result in existential annihilation rather than peaceful presence. The neurological reality is that highly intelligent brains often develop what researchers call default mode network hyperactivity. The brain's background processing system becomes overactive, constantly generating self-referential thoughts, future projections and analytical frameworks, even during supposed rest periods. Your mind has essentially forgotten how to be idle because idleness feels too much like death. To a consciousness that has learned to define itself through thinking, Jung wrote about this as the ego's fear of dissolution. For highly intelligent individuals, the ego structure is often so tightly identified with mental activity that any reduction in thinking feels like a threat to existence itself. Your mind would literally rather suffer through endless analysis than risk the ego death that comes with genuine surrender to present moment awareness. Consider the metaphor of a beautifully designed maze with no exit. Your intelligence creates increasingly sophisticated mental structures, philosophical frameworks, psychological analyses, spiritual concepts that are genuinely impressive and often genuinely helpful, but that ultimately trap you in elaborate cognitive constructions rather than allowing you to experience the simple reality of being alive. In this moment, the cruel irony is that the very insights you generate about the nature of peace, the mechanics of presence, the philosophy of acceptance become new forms of mental content that prevent you from actually experiencing what you're thinking about. You become an expert on water while dying of thirst, a scholar of love while starving for connection, a philosopher of presence while remaining trapped in perpetual analysis. This pattern often develops as a sophisticated avoidance mechanism. The brilliant mind discovers early that thinking provides a sense of control of progress of meaning in situations where direct experience might feel overwhelming, boring, or threatening. So analysis becomes a drug, providing the dopamine hit of understanding while protecting you from the vulnerability of simply being with what is. The addiction is maintained by what we might call intellectual dopamine, the genuine pleasure that comes from insights, connections, revelations, and mental breakthroughs. Your brain has learned to prefer the excitement of figuring things out to the quieter satisfaction of simply experiencing life without needing to understand or improve it. The path to freedom isn't trying to think less. That approach typically creates more mental activity as the mind begins analyzing its attempts to analyze less. Instead, it's learning to use your intelligence in service of presence rather than as an escape from it. This means developing what Jung might call conscious thinking, choosing when to engage the analytical faculties rather than allowing them to run continuously in the background. The 5-minute technique begins with radical honesty. Right? Now, am I thinking because this situation requires analysis? Or am I thinking because thinking has become my default way of avoiding the present moment? If the answer is the latter, the practice becomes, what would it feel like to be here without needing to figure anything out? This isn't anti-intellectual meditation. This is using your exceptional capacity for awareness to notice when thinking serves you versus when you serve thinking. It's learning to treat your analytical abilities like a powerful tool that you pick up when needed, rather than a background process that runs constantly, whether it's useful or not. Start with micro moments of non-analytical awareness. While washing dishes, can you simply feel the warm water and soap without thinking about productivity or mindfulness or anything else? While walking, can you notice your feet touching the ground without generating insights about embodiment or presence? These aren't spiritual practices. They're basic exercises in remembering that consciousness can exist without constant mental commentary. Your intelligence is extraordinary, but it was never meant to be your entire experience of being alive. Learning to occasionally set down the magnificent tool of analysis doesn't diminish your brilliance. It allows you to experience the life that your intelligence was designed to serve rather than dominate. There exists a particularly modern form of suffering that Jung could not have fully anticipated, but would certainly have recognized. The paralysis that comes from seeing too clearly, understanding too deeply, and being aware of too many variables to take decisive action. For highly intelligent individuals living in an information-rich age, consciousness itself can become a form of quicksand. The more you struggle to find the right action through analysis, the more stuck you become. You know this experience intimately. Faced with a decision, your mind immediately begins generating scenarios, analyzing potential outcomes, considering multiple perspectives, weighing ethical implications, anticipating unintended consequences. What should be a simple choice becomes a complex philosophical investigation. What could be intuitive action becomes paralyzed deliberation. This isn't indecisiveness in the conventional sense. This is the burden of a consciousness that has become so sophisticated in its ability to see multiple angles that it has lost the capacity for what Jung called living forward, the ability to act from intuition and make course corrections as you go rather than trying to predict and optimize every possible outcome before taking the first step. The cruel irony is that your exceptional awareness, which should theoretically make you more effective in the world, often makes you less capable of engaging with it spontaneously. You become like a master chess player who can see so many moves ahead that they become paralyzed by the complexity of possibilities rather than simply making the best move available with current information. Jung understood this as what he might call consciousness inflation, where awareness becomes so developed that it begins to interfere with natural psychological processes rather than enhancing them. Your consciousness has become like a microscope, set to maximum magnification. You can see incredible detail, but you've lost the ability to perceive the larger patterns that would actually guide effective action. This pattern often develops in individuals who learned early that mistakes were dangerous, that imperfection was unacceptable, that taking action without complete information was irresponsible. So the mind expands its analytical capacity as a form of insurance against error, creating elaborate decision-making processes that provide the illusion of control while actually preventing the very engagement with life that would provide real feedback and learning. The neurological reality is that this kind of hyperanalysis actually impairs what researchers call somatic decision-making, the body's innate ability to assess situations and guide action through feeling rather than thinking. Your exceptional mind has become so loud that it drowns out the quieter but often more accurate guidance that comes from embodied intuition. Consider the metaphor of a sage standing at the edge of a shallow stream, paralyzed by detailed analysis of water temperature, current patterns, optimal crossing points, and potential risks, while others simply step into the water and walk across. The sage's knowledge is vast and accurate, but it has become a barrier to the simple act of getting wet and learning through direct experience. This creates what we might call the perfectionism of consciousness, where your awareness becomes so refined that ordinary human existence feels crude and unsatisfying. You can see the gaps between intention and execution, the contradictions in your own behavior, the ways that simple actions fall short of ideal standards. This clarity, rather than inspiring improvement, often leads to paralysis and self-criticism. The spiritual dimension of this struggle is that consciousness, when overdeveloped without corresponding development of trust and embodiment, becomes a form of existential anxiety. You become hyper-aware of uncertainty, of complexity, of the impossibility of knowing all variables before acting. This awareness, which could be wisdom, becomes a form of torture when it's not balanced with acceptance of imperfection and uncertainty. As fundamental aspects of being human, Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes crucial here, the psychological capacity that allows consciousness to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them, to act in the presence of uncertainty without needing guarantee of outcomes. For highly intelligent individuals, developing this function often requires consciously cultivating what might feel like strategic ignorance, choosing not to analyze everything that could be analyzed. The transformation begins with recognizing that perfect information is not only impossible but often counterproductive. Your goal isn't to make perfect decisions, but to make conscious decisions that you can learn from and adjust as you go. This requires developing what Jung might call intelligent trust, using your analytical abilities to assess situations reasonably and then trusting your capacity to handle whatever emerges from your choices. The practice involves what we might call embodied decision-making, learning to supplement your mental analysis with somatic awareness. Before making a decision after you've done reasonable mental preparation, ask your body what feels most alive. What direction creates expansion rather than contraction? What choice connects me to my energy rather than depleting it? This isn't anti-intellectual decision-making. It's integrative decision-making that honors both your exceptional analytical abilities and your embodied wisdom. It's learning to use consciousness as a flashlight to illuminate the path, rather than a floodlight that overwhelms you with too much information to process effectively. Start with small, low-stakes decisions where you can practice acting on reasonable analysis plus intuitive sensing rather than exhaustive research. Notice how often your first instinct informed by basic analysis leads to outcomes that are just as good as those that would have resulted from extensive deliberation. Your intelligence is meant to serve your life, not prevent you from living it. Here we encounter one of the most seductive traps for brilliant minds seeking psychological healing and spiritual growth. The unconscious belief that understanding a problem is equivalent to solving it, that insight automatically produces transformation, that intellectual comprehension can substitute for the often messier, slower work of embodied integration. Jung understood this as a form of what he might call mental inflation, where the ego identifies so completely with knowing that it loses touch with the actual process of becoming. You recognize this pattern in yourself. You read extensively about psychological healing, accumulate insights about your own patterns, develop sophisticated frameworks for understanding your trauma responses, your attachment styles, your defense mechanisms. Your knowledge about psychology might rival that of trained therapists. Yet somehow, despite all this understanding, the fundamental emotional patterns remain largely unchanged. This isn't a failure of intelligence or comprehension. This is a misunderstanding of how transformation actually occurs. The mind that understands the mechanics of a wound is different from the body that carries that wound. Intellectual insight operates in the realm of concepts and frameworks, while healing occurs in the realm of felt experience, nervous system regulation, and what Jung called active imagination, the direct engagement with unconscious content through image symbol and embodied practice. The cruel seduction of intellectual healing is that it provides the dopamine hit of progress without requiring the vulnerability of actual change. Your brilliant mind can construct elaborate theories about why you struggle with intimacy develop. Detailed analyses of how your childhood shaped your current relationship patterns, and even understand the neurobiological mechanisms underlying your emotional responses. But understanding why you flinch when someone says we need to talk is different from actually healing the wound that causes the flinch. This pattern often develops in individuals who learned early that knowledge provided safety, that understanding granted control, that being smart could protect against being hurt. So when faced with emotional pain, the mind does what it does best. It creates frameworks, generates insights, and builds conceptual bridges over experiential chasms. The map becomes more familiar than the territory it's supposed to represent. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the symbol-forming function, the psyche's natural ability to generate images and experiences that facilitate transformation beyond what rational understanding can achieve. For highly intelligent individuals, this function often becomes suppressed in favor of conceptual analysis, creating people who know themselves thoroughly in theory while remaining strangers to themselves in practice. Consider the metaphor of a perfectly accurate map of a country you've never visited. The map contains extraordinary detail, topographical features, climate patterns, cultural information, historical context. You could teach a university course about this country based on your map knowledge. But until you actually travel there, breathe the air, feel the soil beneath your feet, taste the local food and navigate the streets with your own body, your relationship to that country remains fundamentally abstract. This is often what happens. With psychological and spiritual development for brilliant minds, you accumulate maps, therapeutic insights, spiritual concepts, philosophical frameworks, while the actual territory of your inner world remains largely unexplored through direct experience. You become an expert on healing without necessarily becoming healed, a scholar of transformation, without necessarily being transformed. The neurological reality is that lasting change requires integration between the prefrontal cortex, where your insights live, and the limbic system, where your emotional patterns are stored. Simply generating new thoughts about old wounds doesn't automatically create new neural pathways. The brain that understands your attachment trauma is different from the nervous system that still responds as if danger is present when someone gets emotionally close. The path beyond intellectual healing begins with recognizing what Jung called the difference between knowing about and knowing through. Knowing about your patterns means being able to describe, analyze, and theorize about them. Knowing through your patterns means having developed the capacity to feel them arise, stay present with the sensations they create, and choose different responses from a place of embodied awareness rather than conceptual understanding. This requires developing what we might call somatic curiosity, approaching your emotional patterns not just as problems to be understood, but as energetic experiences to be felt, metabolized, and integrated through the body. When you notice a familiar psychological pattern arising, instead of immediately moving into analysis mode, try asking, what does this feel like in my body? Where do I sense tension, contraction, or activation? What would it be like to breathe with this sensation rather than think about it? The integration practice involves what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with your psychological content through image sensation and embodied experience rather than just conceptual analysis. This might mean dialoguing with the part of you that's afraid of intimacy, visualizing yourself offering compassion to your wounded inner child, or simply sitting with difficult emotions long enough to let them move through your system rather than immediately trying to understand or fix them. This doesn't mean abandoning your intellectual insights. They provide valuable context and understanding. But it means learning to use those insights as a foundation for experiential work rather than as a substitute for it. Your brilliant mind can illuminate the path, but healing happens when you actually walk that path with your whole being, not just your thinking function. Start with small experiments in embodied integration. When you have an insight about yourself, ask, how can I practice this understanding in my body right now? What would it feel like to embody this insight rather than just know it? This might mean breathing differently, moving differently, speaking differently, or simply allowing yourself to feel emotions that your insights have identified, but that you haven't actually experienced. Your intellectual gifts are valuable allies in the healing process, but they were never meant to carry the entire burden of transformation. Learning to think about healing, while also feeling your way through it, creates the kind of integrated development that honors both your exceptional mind and your full humanity. The emotional bypass. When rationality becomes a defense against feeling, deep in the architecture of brilliant minds lies a sophisticated defense mechanism that Jung would have recognized as a form of what we might call intellectual dissociation, the unconscious use of analytical thinking to create distance from emotional experience. For individuals whose intelligence has been consistently rewarded and whose sensitivity might have been discouraged, reason becomes not just a tool for understanding the world, but a fortress protecting against the vulnerability of actually feeling it. You know this pattern intimately, though you might not recognize it as a defense. Someone criticizes you, and instead of feeling hurt, you immediately begin analyzing their motivations, their psychological patterns, the ways their feedback might reflect their own unresolved issues. A relationship ends, and rather than grieving, you create detailed post-mortems about compatibility, attachment styles, and the sociological factors that make modern love challenging. This isn't emotional maturity. It's emotional avoidance dressed in the elegant clothing of psychological sophistication. Your brilliant mind has learned to transform every feeling into a thinking problem, every emotional experience into an intellectual exercise. The result is that you can discuss emotions with remarkable insight while remaining largely disconnected from your own emotional reality. Jung understood this as a failure of what he called the feeling function, not emotions in the reactive sense, but the capacity for authentic evaluation of what matters, what has value, what touches your soul versus what merely engages your mind. When thinking dominates feeling, you develop exceptional analytical abilities while losing touch with your own inner compass, your authentic preferences, your genuine responses to life. The cruel irony is that this pattern often develops as protection against emotional overwhelm. Perhaps you learned early that feelings were dangerous, unpredictable, or unwelcome. Maybe you discovered that being smart was safer than being sensitive, that analysis earned approval while emotional expression led to rejection or dismissal. So your mind expanded to fill the space where spontaneous feeling should have lived. Consider the metaphor of a sophisticated climate control system that maintains perfect temperature and humidity while filtering out all natural air. The environment becomes technically optimal but sterile, lacking the subtle variations and natural elements that make spaces feel alive. This is often what happens to the emotional atmosphere of highly intelligent individuals, technically well-managed but experientially impoverished. The neurological cost of chronic emotional bypassing is significant. When you consistently route emotional experiences through analytical processing, you actually weaken the neural pathways between the limbic system and the body, making it increasingly difficult to access emotional information even when you want to. Your exceptional mind essentially creates a buffer zone between you and your own feeling reality. This manifests in various ways: the inability to answer simple questions like, "How do you feel about that?" without first analyzing the situation, the tendency to discuss your own emotional experiences as if they belong to someone else, the strange sensation of watching your life from a distance, even while living it, the persistent sense that something essential is missing despite having your psychological life apparently well organized. Jung wrote about this as a form of what he might call participation mystique, with thinking, becoming so identified with mental processes that you lose the capacity for what he called feeling-toned complexes, those rich emotional experiences that give life meaning, depth, and authentic personal significance. You become a brilliant observer of life while struggling to be a full participant in it. The transformation begins with developing what we might call emotional courage, the willingness to feel things without immediately needing to understand, categorize, or solve them. This requires recognizing that emotions aren't problems to be fixed, but experiences to be metabolized, not puzzles to be solved, but energies to be felt and integrated. The practice starts small and builds gradually. When you notice yourself moving into analytical mode in response to an emotional trigger, pause and ask, what would happen if I felt this without thinking about it? What sensations are present in my body right now? What would it be like to breathe with this experience rather than analyze it? This isn't about becoming less intelligent or abandoning your analytical gifts. It's about learning to use thinking and feeling as collaborative faculties, rather than allowing thinking to dominate and suppress feeling. It's discovering that emotions, far from being obstacles to clear thinking, are actually sources of information that can inform and enrich your analytical processes. Begin with what Jung called active feeling, consciously choosing to feel your responses to situations rather than immediately thinking about them. When someone compliments you, notice the feeling before the analysis. When you're disappointed, feel the disappointment before figuring out why you're disappointed. When you're moved by beauty, let yourself be moved before explaining why the beauty affects you. Your exceptional analytical abilities are valuable, but they were never meant to be your entire mode of engaging with life. Learning to think with your heart as well as your head doesn't diminish your intelligence. It integrates your intelligence with your full humanity, creating a more complete and satisfying way of being in the world. The utilitarian trap. When brilliance becomes a performance hidden within the psychology of exceptional intelligence, lies a particularly insidious trap that Jung might have recognized as a form of what we could call functional inflation, the unconscious equation of personal worth with intellectual utility, where your value as a human being becomes dependent on your ability to be impressive, helpful, or intellectually stimulating. This creates a fundamental split between who you are and what you can produce, leading to a life lived in constant performance rather than authentic being. You recognize this pattern in the exhaustion that comes not from thinking itself, but from the pressure to think impressively. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to demonstrate insight. Every problem becomes a chance to showcase analytical prowess. Every social interaction carries the subtle burden of maintaining your reputation as someone who always has something interesting to say, someone whose mind can be counted on to generate value for others. This isn't conscious arrogance or calculated manipulation. This is often the result of early conditioning, where love, attention, and acceptance were consistently linked to intellectual performance rather than simple being. The child who learned that being smart earned positive regard, that insights were rewarded with approval, that intelligence could bridge gaps where emotional connection felt uncertain or unsafe. The cruel evolution of this pattern is that it becomes self-perpetuating. People begin to relate to you primarily through your intellectual gifts, seeking you out for your analytical abilities, your capacity to generate insights, your talent for seeing solutions. You become typecast in your own life as the smart one, creating relationships that feed your mind while starving your soul. Jung would have understood this as a form of what he called persona inflation, where you become so identified with the social mask of intelligence that you lose touch with the fuller spectrum of your humanity. Your persona as the brilliant one becomes not just how others see you, but how you see yourself, creating a prison made of your own giftedness. Consider the metaphor of a master musician who can only relate to others through performance, who has forgotten how to simply sit with people without needing to entertain, educate, or impress them. The talent is genuine, the skill remarkable, but the human being behind the talent feels unseen, unknown, valued only for what they can produce rather than appreciated for who they are when they're not producing anything at all. This creates what we might call intellectual codependency, a dynamic where you become addicted to being needed for your mental gifts while others become dependent on your insights rather than developing their own relationship with wisdom. Everyone gets something from the arrangement, but no one gets authentic connection or genuine intimacy. The deeper cost is existential. When your sense of worth depends on intellectual performance, you begin to fear the natural rhythms of mental rest, creative downtime, or simple being without producing insights. Your value feels precarious, dependent on your next clever observation, your next helpful analysis, your next demonstration of mental agility. You become afraid of ordinariness, of moments when you're just human rather than impressively human. The neurological reality is that chronic intellectual performance actually impairs the brain's capacity for rest and restoration. When you're constantly generating insights for others, you're operating in what researchers call task-positive networks, rather than allowing the default mode network to restore and integrate experiences. Your brain becomes like a muscle that never relaxes, gradually losing flexibility and creativity. Jung's path toward individuation becomes crucial here. The process of becoming who you truly are rather than who you think you should be or who others need you to be. For brilliant minds caught in utilitarian patterns, this often means learning to value your being as much as your doing, your presence, as much as your insights, your humanity, as much as your intelligence. The liberation begins with small experiments in non-performative presence. Practice spending time with people without needing to be helpful, insightful, or intellectually stimulating. Notice what it feels like to simply be present without having your mental gifts on display. Can you enjoy a conversation that doesn't showcase your analytical abilities? Can you let others struggle with problems without immediately offering solutions? This requires developing what we might call strategic ordinariness, consciously, choosing moments of intellectual non-performance, not because you can't think brilliantly, but because you don't need to prove your worth through constant mental display. It's learning the difference between offering gifts from fullness versus performing gifts from emptiness. Begin to notice the difference between genuine curiosity and performative inquiry, between authentic insight and intellectual showing off. When you have an insight, ask yourself, am I sharing this because it serves the situation or because I need to demonstrate my intelligence? Would this conversation be just as valuable if I contributed presence and listening rather than analysis? And solutions. The goal isn't to diminish your intellectual gifts, but to free them from the burden of carrying your entire sense of self-worth. When your value as a person becomes independent of your intellectual performance, your mind becomes free to offer its gifts spontaneously and authentically rather than compulsively and defensively. Your brilliance is extraordinary, but it was never meant to be your entire identity. Learning to be valued for your presence as much as your insights for your heart, as much as your mind for your humanity, as much as your intelligence, creates the foundation for relationships and self-regard that can weather the natural cycles of mental productivity and rest. The consciousness curse. When awareness becomes suffering, there exists a form of suffering that is almost exclusive to highly developed minds. The burden of seeing too clearly, understanding too deeply, and being aware of patterns and truths that others either cannot perceive or prefer to ignore. Jung touched on this in his discussions of what he called the wounded healer archetype, but perhaps never fully articulated the particular anguish that comes with exceptional consciousness in a world that often operates through unconsciousness, denial and comfortable illusions. You know this weight intimately. You see the ways people deceive themselves, the patterns they repeat unconsciously, the illusions they maintain to avoid difficult truths. You perceive the gaps between what people say and what they mean, between their conscious intentions and their unconscious motivations, between the stories they tell themselves and the reality they're actually living. This isn't cynicism or judgment, though it can evolve into both as a defense against the overwhelming nature of seeing so much. This is simply the natural result of developing what Jung called differentiated consciousness, the capacity to perceive subtle distinctions, hidden patterns and unconscious dynamics that operate beneath the surface of ordinary social interaction. The cruel irony is that this gift of perception, which should theoretically make life easier to navigate, often makes it more difficult to simply participate in. When you can see the unconscious dynamics playing out in your family, the shadow projections happening in your workplace, the ways that entire cultures maintain themselves through collective denial, it becomes increasingly challenging to engage with these systems naturally and spontaneously. You begin to feel like an anthropologist studying human behavior rather than a human simply living human life. The awareness that was meant to liberate you becomes a form of isolation, separating you from the innocent participation that others seem to enjoy effortlessly. You become conscious of things you cannot unknown, aware of patterns you cannot unsee. Jung understood this as part of what he called the price of consciousness, the recognition that awareness brings responsibility, that seeing clearly requires choosing how to respond to what you see, that knowledge creates ethical obligations, that ignorance does not carry. With greater consciousness comes greater complexity, not greater simplicity. Consider the metaphor of developing night vision in a world where most people navigate by daylight. Your enhanced perception allows you to see things others miss, to navigate in darkness, to perceive dangers and opportunities that are invisible. Get a normal vision. But this same enhancement makes ordinary daylight overwhelming, makes you sensitive to illumination that others find comfortable, creates a different relationship to light and shadow than those around you experience. The spiritual dimension of this challenge is that exceptional consciousness often comes with what we might call existential sensitivity, an acute awareness of mortality, meaninglessness, and the fundamental uncertainty that underlies all human endeavors. While others might live comfortably within conventional frameworks of meaning, your developed awareness sees through these frameworks to the void they're constructed over. This creates what Jung might recognize as a form of metaphysical loneliness. Not just social isolation, but existential isolation, the sense that you're experiencing reality at a different level of intensity and complexity than those around you. You become aware of dimensions of existence that others don't see, burdened with questions that others don't ask, sensitive to subtleties that others don't notice. The temptation is to either become superior and dismissive toward those who operate with less awareness, or to try to diminish your own consciousness to fit in better with conventional levels of perception. Both responses create suffering, the first through isolation and arrogance, the second through self-betrayal and the suffocation of your authentic perceptual gifts. Jung's path toward integration involves what he called carrying the tension of opposites, learning to hold both your exceptional awareness and your basic humanity, both your capacity to see clearly and your need to belong, both your sensitivity to truth and your desire for simple participation in life. This requires developing what we might call conscious naivety, the ability to engage innocently with life, even while maintaining awareness of its complexity. The practice begins with accepting your consciousness as both gift and burden, recognizing that awareness is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be integrated. Your sensitivity to patterns, unconscious dynamics, and hidden truths doesn't make you better than others. It makes you different, with different responsibilities and different forms of contribution to the collective human experience. Learn to use your exceptional awareness selectively and strategically, rather than having it constantly activated. Develop the capacity to choose when to engage your deep perception and when to simply participate in surface-level interaction without feeling compelled to analyze everything you see. Your consciousness is a powerful tool, but like any tool, it serves you best when you control when and how to use it. Begin to see your awareness not as a burden, but as a form of service to yourself, to others, and to the evolution of consciousness itself. Your capacity to see clearly while sometimes isolating also makes you capable of illuminating patterns and truths that can help others develop greater awareness if and when they're ready for it. The goal isn't to become less conscious, but to become more skillful with consciousness. Learning to carry your awareness with grace, to use your perception in service of love rather than judgment, and to find meaning in the very sensitivity that sometimes feels like a curse. Your consciousness is not a mistake. It's an invitation to a more complex but potentially more meaningful way of participating in the human experience. The shadow of intelligence. When brilliance hides emotional wounds, perhaps the most sophisticated defense mechanism available to exceptional minds is the capacity to use intelligence itself as a shield against recognizing and healing fundamental emotional wounds. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or remain unconscious of, but he may not have fully anticipated how brilliance itself can become a shadow function, hiding emotional injuries behind impressive intellectual facades. Your intelligence can become what we might call a golden shadow, not the typical shadow of rejected negative qualities, but a sophisticated defense structure that prevents you from accessing the wounded, vulnerable, or unhealed aspects of your psyche that require attention. The very mind that could potentially illuminate and heal these wounds instead becomes their protector, creating elaborate intellectual frameworks that explain, justify, or analyze around emotional realities rather than facing them directly. This manifests in countless subtle ways. You can discuss attachment theory with remarkable sophistication while remaining unconsciously terrified of genuine intimacy. You can analyze the psychology of grief while never allowing yourself to fully feel your own losses. You can understand trauma responses with clinical precision while maintaining emotional armor that prevents you from actually healing your own traumas. The cruel brilliance of this defense is that it provides the illusion of psychological work while preventing actual psychological change. Your mind generates insights about your patterns, creates frameworks for understanding your behaviors, and develops sophisticated explanations for your emotional responses. But somehow, despite all this mental activity, the fundamental emotional patterns remain largely untouched, operating from unconscious depths that your conscious intelligence never quite reaches. Jung would have recognized this as a form of what he called intellectual inflation, where the ego identifies so completely with mental function that it loses touch with other aspects of the psyche, particularly those aspects that carry emotional, pain, unmet needs, or experiences that don't fit the identity of being the smart one. Your intelligence becomes not just a capacity, but an identity that must be protected from any experiences that might reveal vulnerability, confusion, or emotional rawness. Consider the metaphor of a brilliant architect who designs increasingly sophisticated buildings while never addressing the unstable foundation underneath. The structures are genuinely impressive, the designs authentic works of art, but they're all built over geological instability that will eventually affect everything constructed above it. The architect's very skill in construction becomes a way of avoiding the foundational work that would actually create lasting stability. For highly intelligent individuals, this often means that the same mental abilities that allow you to help others heal, to understand psychological dynamics, to navigate complex social situations, become barriers to your own emotional development. You become expert in everyone else's psychology while remaining a stranger to your own emotional landscape, skilled at illuminating others' shadows while keeping your own in sophisticated darkness. The pattern typically develops in childhood when intelligence becomes a survival strategy. Perhaps emotional expression was unsafe, vulnerability was met with rejection, or being smart was the only way to earn attention and approval. So the mind expanded to fill the space where emotional authenticity should have developed, creating a person who can think brilliantly about feelings while struggling to actually feel their own feelings. The deeper wound often involves what Jung called the unlived life, aspects of your authentic self that were sacrificed to maintain the identity of being intellectually exceptional. The playful child who was too serious, the creative dreamer who became too practical, the emotional being who learned to be too rational. These unlived aspects don't disappear. They live in the shadow, influencing your life from unconscious depths. The transformation begins with what Jung called befriending the shadow, developing a conscious relationship with the parts of yourself that your intelligence has been protecting you from seeing. This requires incredible courage because it means temporarily setting aside the identity that has served you so well and allowing yourself to be seen as confused, vulnerable, or emotionally raw. This doesn't mean becoming less intelligent or abandoning your analytical gifts. It means learning to use your intelligence in service of integration rather than avoidance, turning your exceptional capacity for understanding toward the emotional territories you've been unconsciously avoiding. It means asking not just, how can I understand this, but how can I feel this, how can I heal this, how can I integrate this? The practice involves what we might call conscious vulnerability, using your analytical abilities to create safe containers for experiencing emotions that your intelligence has been helping you avoid. This might mean working with a therapist who can match your intellectual sophistication while helping you access emotional territories, or creating structured practices that allow you to feel your feelings while maintaining enough intellectual framework to feel safe. Begin by asking yourself, what emotional experiences has my intelligence been helping me avoid? What wounds have I analyzed but not actually healed? What aspects of my emotional life remain terra incognita, despite my psychological sophistication? The answers to these questions point toward the shadow territories where real healing and integration await. Your intelligence is a tremendous gift, but it was never meant to carry the entire burden of your psychological development. Learning to use your brilliant mind as an ally in emotional healing, rather than a defense against it, creates the possibility for integration that honors both your exceptional abilities and your full humanity. The transcendence of intellectual suffering, integration and wholeness. After exploring the various ways that exceptional intelligence can become both gift and burden, we arrive at perhaps the most crucial understanding. The suffering that comes with brilliance is not a life sentence, but a form of initiation. Jung understood this as part of what he called the individuation process, the psychological journey toward becoming whole, authentic, and fully yourself, rather than who you think you should be or who others need you to be. For highly intelligent individuals, this journey often requires what we might call the integration of opposites. Learning to honor both your exceptional mental gifts and your fundamental humanity, both your capacity for sophisticated analysis and your need for simple emotional connection, both your ability to see complex truths and your desire to participate innocently in life's ordinary pleasures. The path toward wholeness doesn't involve diminishing your intelligence or pretending to be less aware than you are. Instead, it requires expanding your identity beyond intellectual performance to include the full spectrum of human experience. Feeling intuiting, sensing being present, connecting authentically, and allowing yourself to be moved by beauty touched, by love and changed by experiences that can't be analyzed or optimized. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For brilliant minds, this often means discovering that you are so much more than your thoughts, so much richer than your insights, so much more interesting than your analytical abilities. Your intelligence is one instrument in the orchestra of your being, powerful and important, but most beautiful when harmonizing with other capacities rather than performing solo. This integration begins with what Jung called the transcendent function, the psychological capacity that bridges conscious and unconscious thinking and feeling, analysis and experience. Developing this function allows you to use your exceptional intelligence in service of your full humanity, rather than as an escape from it or a substitute for it. The practice involves learning to recognize when your mind is serving you versus when you are serving your mind. Intelligence becomes truly intelligent when it knows when to engage and when to rest, when to analyze, and when to feel, when to understand, and when to simply be present with mystery. This is not the abandonment of thinking, but the mastery of thinking, using your brilliant mind as a conscious tool, rather than being unconsciously used by it. This transformation often requires what Jung called suffering consciously, allowing yourself to feel the full impact of emotions, experiences, and truths that your intelligence might prefer to analyze, rather than experience. This conscious suffering is not masochism, but integration, the willingness to let your heart break open so that your mind can serve love rather than just understanding. For many brilliant individuals, this journey involves grieving the unlived life, mourning the spontaneous, emotional, intuitive aspects of yourself that were sacrificed to develop and maintain intellectual excellence. This grief is not self-pity but recognition, honoring what was lost so that it can be reclaimed and integrated into a fuller way of being. The emerging wholeness doesn't eliminate your intellectual gifts, but contextualizes them within a larger identity that includes emotional authenticity, embodied presence, intuitive wisdom, and the capacity for wonder, vulnerability, and genuine connection. You remain brilliant, but you become humanly brilliant, rather than just intellectually brilliant. This integration often manifests as what we might call conscious ordinariness, the ability to be extraordinarily intelligent, while also being remarkably present, deeply feeling and genuinely connected to the simple human experiences that give life meaning beyond achievement or understanding. You learn to be impressive when the situation calls for it, and ordinary when ordinariness serves better. The final paradox of intellectual development is that true intelligence eventually transcends itself, not by becoming less intelligent, but by becoming so intelligent that it recognizes intelligence as just one faculty among many powerful, but not ultimate valuable, but not comprehensive. The highest intelligence is the intelligence that knows when not to be intelligent, that can think brilliantly, and then set thinking aside to dance, to cry, to love, to laugh, to be silent, to simply exist, without needing to understand or optimize the experience of existing. Your exceptional mind brought you to this point of recognition, but from here the journey continues, not through more thinking, but through more being, not through greater analysis, but through deeper integration, not through increased understanding, but through expanded aliveness. Your intelligence becomes the servant of your wholeness, rather than its master, a beautiful part of a complete human being, rather than the only part you're willing to acknowledge. This is the true transcendence of intellectual suffering, not the elimination of your brilliant mind, but its integration into a life so rich, so full, so authentically lived, that your intelligence becomes just one note in a symphony of human experience that includes every capacity for love, growth, and authentic connection, that makes existence meaningful beyond what any mind, however exceptional, could ever understand or control. Jung's final insight was that individuation is never complete. It's an ongoing process of becoming more fully yourself, more completely human, more genuinely alive. For brilliant minds, this means using your exceptional gifts not to escape the human condition, but to engage with it more fully, more consciously, and more lovingly than would be possible without the very intelligence that sometimes feels like such a burden. Your mind is extraordinary, but you are more than your mind. Your thoughts are sophisticated, but you are larger than your thoughts. Your intelligence is remarkable, but your full humanity is the real masterpiece. One that includes your brilliant mind as just one beautiful aspect of a complete and endlessly fascinating human being who deserves to be known, loved, and celebrated. Not just for what they can think, but for who they truly are. The conversation continues not in analysis, but in living, not in understanding, but in being, not in solving the mystery of existence, but in becoming intimate with it through every faculty you possess: intellectual, emotional, intuitive, physical, and spiritual. This is where true intelligence leads not to more knowledge, but to more life, not to greater understanding, but to deeper love, not to perfect analysis, but to imperfect, beautiful, completely human existence. Your intelligence brought you here. Your full humanity will take you the rest of the way home.